So this is going to be my views on morality. Do I believe in subjective morality, or do I believe that morality is objective? Where do I believe morality comes from, and why do I believe that? I'm going to answer literally every single one of those questions, starting with the first one. It's subjective, and it can only be subjective. If you've seen me debate this topic before, I was going to this week actually with Apophatic, a buddy of mine. I'm going to make myself in the corner right there. Then you would know that I have believed this ever since departing from Christianity. But now I'll explain why I believe this. First, I'm going to define what these words mean. And I've picked what I believe to be the most uncontroversial definition of morality which I could possibly think of, which is not leaning towards one conclusion or the other. Morality means the intuitive system on what is good, bad, right, and wrong. Good, bad, right, and wrong, of course, is the essence of morality. A being, in this case, I use being instead of a person just because I believe that morality exists in all living things. Dogs and cats have morality. Dogs and deer and lions and gazelles have morality. And the word that people get caught up on the most is intuitive. So intuitive, just for the context of this definition, I'm going to define as to do something without needing conscious reasoning. So in this context, that means that I just know intuitively. I just know without conscious reasoning. I don't need to rationalize as to why I know that something is good. That's what makes it intuitive. Now, objective and subjective really also shouldn't be controversial in any way. Objective in this context just means information that is always true, external to the human mind. That means that it doesn't matter if human beings were wiped off the face of the universe. It is an objective fact, such as the Earth orbits around the sun, would still be true, even if humans no longer existed. Information, that means that subjective morality is information that is dependent on the human mind. That applies to facts such as the best color is blue. This information is true dependent on the person who's saying it. I would find that the best color to be red, if I could find the best color to be red, you could find it to be blue, and that's what makes it dependent and subjective. So that means that objective morality is the intuitive system of good, bad, right, and wrong, which would be true, external to the human mind, and subjective morality means the intuitive system of good, bad, right, and wrong, which is dependent on the human mind. So in this case, if morality is objective, then that would mean that the phrase, murder is wrong, is true regardless of human thought. If morality is subjective, then that would mean that the phrase, murder is wrong, simply depends on the perspective of the person who's saying it. Now, the difference between the two is simply the agent which is responsible for prescribing human beings with their morality. I'm going to say that again in big Bubba full screen, okay? The only difference between the two is the agent in which prescribes morality. The objectivist is saying that there is some ultimate lawgiver, God, right? The subjective moralist is saying that the agent which prescribes morality is the individual themselves, not some external or ultimate lawgiver. Oops, make myself small. Oops, I can see myself accidentally clicking on stuff. Okay. I'm going to go back a little bit. Okay. So, now I'm going to put together what is the source of a person's morality in a subjectivist worldview. These yellow slides are me defending the subjectivist worldview. Now, this is the part where people, when I get into debates and in VCs, have told me is the hardest to understand. So I'll be sure to walk through what I mean with a visual aid, and I'm going to put definitions on the side. I will explain under a subjective worldview where morality comes from. A person's morality is at the center. The biggest circles determine the smaller circles within them. So this circle is determined by this one, which is determined by this one, which is determined by this one. Okay. Now, so the first question, what determines a person's morality? The answer is conditioning. Now, conditioning simply means the process which shapes our beliefs. So conditioning a person's morality means that you are simply shaping the beliefs of the person, the way that a person sees good, bad, right, and wrong. Now, with that, what is conditioning determined by? Conditioning is determined by society, and I don't mean that in the traditional sense. What I mean by society in this context is the immediate environment which a person is exposed to. So, as a child, my mother, my siblings, my dad, my teachers, my friends, and my family are all people within the society that is shaping my morality when I'm receiving information on what is good, bad, right, and wrong. This happens whether you know it or not. When I'm a child and I see my mom give dad a kiss and my dad smiles when that happens, the information that I'm receiving leads me to believe that kissing someone makes them feel happy, which is good. The last thing on the chart, the society is determined by the history. I use history instead of, some people use evolution. I use the word history just because history in this case is just the time and place that you were born into. So where you were at in history. It makes more sense to say where you were at in evolution. Why is that important? Because if I am living in America in the year 2025, I'm going to have a very different moral framework on African Americans than if I were to be living in the America in the year 1825. So let me make it very clear now that we have the full visual aid. To summarize, a person's morality is determined by the process which forms a person's beliefs. Next, the process which forms a person's beliefs is determined by the immediate environment which the person is exposed to. Okay, next, the immediate environment in which a person is exposed to is determined by the time and place which you were born into. Why is this such a big deal to me? Why did I just go through all this effort to lay it out with visual aids and definitions and big circles and little circles and all this shit? It's because I went to college with a focus on behavioral psychology. And one of the first things that I learned was the conditioning process, the process which forms a person's beliefs. That's what explains that is what can be used to explain all of a person's behaviors, which I just laid out here in this little circle chart. The process is not responsible for just conditioning a person's morality. This is what you learn on the first day of Psychology 101. What I'm going to show is Maslow's needs pyramid. Maslow's needs is a pyramid which shows things which all people desire. The very bottom is the most surface level needs that we have, which is based on our biology. And the very top is the things which cut into the deepest core of our psychology, of our sense of self or our consciousness. The conditioning process is responsible for creativity, purpose, sense of our morality, of course, meaning, confidence, sense of self, types of people that you consider to be friendly, self-acceptance, social awareness, and many more things. But I don't see any objective moralists trying to argue that there is some type of objective confidence that everyone is following. I don't see objective moralists trying to argue that there is some type of objective way to express creativity or purpose. If you're going to say that there is an objective moral lawgiver, then you might as well say that there is an objective creativity lawgiver, which is absurd. And everyone kind of knows it's absurd, which is why this basic psychology is just thrown out the window by objective moralists. Next point. Next point is the biggest problem that people in general will have with a subjectivist moral worldview. And it's that saying, what a objectivist will say is that a subjectivist believes that there is no moral truth. That means that rape and murder and sexism, incest, racism all these things on the screen and homophobia are not objectively bad. So, Bubba, I'll make myself big for this statement. So, Bubba, are these things bad? My answer, of course, is yes and no. Of course, these things are not objectively good or bad, but the subjective moralist like myself will say that I, as an individual, believe that all of these things, all of these things are in fact bad, and it's perfectly rational for me to do so. And I am like I said in the beginning with the definitions of the definition of subjective morality, I am the agent which prescribe my own morality, and I determine that all of these things are bad. Which, this is kind of a bullet that the subjective moralist does have to bite if you're ever debating a theist, perhaps. An objective moralist might kind of take the high ground in this regard and say that people are and say that, you know, they've won the argument because, oh, Bubba, you're saying that rape, incest, genocide, all these things aren't objectively bad. You're a piece of shit then. My response would be, well, just because believing that murder is objectively bad is a comfortable feeling to have, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. And also, just because I am saying that none of these things come from a ultimate lawgiver, that does not mean that my ability to perceive good and evil just ceases to exist, like the objectivist will always imply. Like I said earlier, the only difference between an objectivist and a subjectivist is you're moving the agent which prescribes our morality from an ultimate lawgiver down to the individual. Just because it is comfortable to believe that unicorns exist in the fourth dimension and they are feeding me with knowledge and wisdom, that doesn't mean that it is true. Good, bad, right, and wrong still exist, just not in the way that an objectivist perceives. Next point, final point that I'm going to be defending is morality, when an objectivist will try to say that morality is just your preferences. It's the next common objection that I hear. It's like, your morality, what you consider to be good and bad, is just based on what you prefer it to be. And ultimately, this will lead the world down to nihilism. And my response to that is, what the fuck are you talking about? The person who is saying that morality is simply just your preferences has the most simplistic and ridiculous understanding of how human behavior works. The way that your morality can just be changed on your preferences is ridiculous. That's like implying that I can just prefer to believe that incest is okay. That's like trying to say that I can just prefer that rape and murder is just they're okay just because I prefer them. It's the conditioning process, as I've described it, is a long, tedious process which would take months of reconditioning a person's brain to think and behave a certain way. But for someone to imply that it's just based off of something such as preferences, which can easily change overnight, is retardation. And it's something that obviously pisses me off. It's like an objective moralist who says that it's just whatever I prefer to believe is ridiculous. And that's kind of like my last point to defend, but then I'm going to be moving on to something a little bit more chill, which is actually attacking the objectivist worldview. What I put forward in these red slides is like me actually going on the offense and kind of presenting an objectivist worldview with a couple things. What I put forward is this criteria, if you will, how to prove objective morality. I would believe two things are necessary for morality to be objective. Some people that I've spoken to have criteria that's like 9 or 10 or 12 things, but I only have two, which I think is reasonable. Two things: a moral truth, which is objectively good or bad or evil, and why we ought to or ought not to do it. Now, I put this forward because if we were to all have an intuitive moral system, which is good, an intuitive moral system external to the human mind, that would mean that We all know what is right and wrong, first of all, and we intuitively know why it is right or wrong, which is just a rephrasing of the definition that I put earlier. So, in this scenario, I'm going to grant point number 1, a thing that is objectively good or evil. Like, let's say, for example, that the 10 Commandments are an example of something that is defined by God to be objectively the correct ways in which we ought to behave. The burden would only fall on the objectivist to prove point 2, why we ought to do it. This next question is what changed my perspective of how to see morality. Can you prove why we ought to do something? I challenge anyone. Can you prove why we ought to do something? It seems instinctive to say that because something is good, we ought to do it. However, just because something is instinctive, that does not make it true. An instinct implies a subjective impulse, which is dependent on previous behaviors. What I'm proposing is that even if your moral intuitions were to point towards an objective truth, then what you are using is a subjective impulse in order to exemplify what is an objective truth. I want to say that again because that probably was hard to understand. You cannot use a subjective impulse to exemplify or to prove an objective truth. I hope that made sense because I'm getting a little bit tongue-tied with the words subjective and objective. So, how about instead I grant criteria number 2? Criteria number 2, why we ought to do what is good. In this scenario, the why, I can just think of, there's a million reasons as why you ought to behave a certain way. For example, we could try to achieve world peace or please God. Then I would just ask you to then, of course, the burden is to provide point 1. What is something that is objectively good? If our purpose to do good is to achieve world peace or please God, then what is something that objectively does any of those things? Can we all agree on something that objectively points towards world peace, or to objectively point towards something that pleases God? We have people who believe we will always have people who disagree with each other and say that this is the correct way to please God, or this is the correct way to achieve world peace. It seems like we consider to be achieving why we ought to behave is ultimately subjective. So what gives, Bubba? Make myself big for this point. What the fuck gives? It seems like the criteria that I provided, the criteria which I provided, a moral truth which is objectively good or evil, and also why we ought to do it, is impossible. Because no matter what is provided, then I, Bubba, me, I'm just going to go ahead and say that it's, what I'm saying is subjective. Like it's subjective in one way or the other. It's subjective thought or subjective impulse. So since my criteria is impossible, then therefore it's fucking stupid. Why did I present it in the first place? Well, I'll let you know that up to this point, I've been using a high-level debate tactic called fucking lying. I lied to you. This isn't my criteria on how to prove. This is not my criteria on how to prove objective morality. It was Dr. William Lane Craig's criteria on how to prove what is objectively morally true. In this paper, Notion of Morality, it is looking at the way that Dr. William Lane Craig's notion that objective morality is true, and here is why. He provides in this paper, he defines objective morality to be because 1, a moral law that we all follow, criteria 1, and 2, a duty to follow it, the why, criteria 2. So don't take the criteria from me, pit it on Dr. William Lane Craig, whose criteria I adopted for the purposes of this fucking video. Don't worry, I'm not gonna lie anymore for the rest of the video. But I do agree with Dr. William Lane Craig's criteria. I just wanted to exemplify that ultimately it will fall under a subjective instinct one way or the other. So, next thing, I just played, I did ultimately just lie, so I probably pissed a lot of people off. So, let's relax a little bit, and I'm going to present just two different people, because this is my next point, my next kind of zing against an objective worldview, an objectivist worldview. Imagine with me that you have two atheists, these two guys. Atheist one believes in, hold on, I'll move myself down. Believes that, So atheist one believes that abortion, killing in self-defense, and owning a gun are good things which are justifiable. Atheist 2 believes that all those things are not justifiable. They are ultimately bad things. Okay, cool. So these two truths, person 1 and person 2, they have what they believe to be an objective truth about what is moral, what is good, bad, right, and wrong. Okay. Now these two truths, they contradict each other. They believe that that their personal morality provides more ethical truth. They were conditioned to believe these things, and the moral basis comes from their own personal intuitive system. All those things are fair to say, whether you're an objectivist or a subjectivist. These four statements right here are true. Now, what I have just described is the exact same reasons, and it's the exact same thing for two people with opposing religions, with two different objective moral laws. When a Christian and a Muslim, when a Christian who follows the law of Moses and the Muslim who follows the laws of the Quran, the same thing is true about the atheists. The true truths contradict each other. They believe that their morality provides more ethical truth. They were conditioned to believe these things, and the moral basis comes from their own personal intuitive system. There is no difference whatsoever in the reasoning why the theist and the atheist believes in the moral law which they believe to be objective, which they believe to be correct, I should say. I misspoke. Which they believe to be correct. The only difference, it seems, is that the theists are disagreeing on what is the true God, and the atheists just have their own moral basis to stand on. So, I'm done directly attacking the objectivist worldview. Instead, what I'm going to do in these blue slides, this is my final section, is I'm going to be building up a case for the subjectivist worldview. So, I have 4 points to make, and I'm going to make them all relatively fast. The first point's kind of the longest point, though. So, point 1. This will be this will be pretty much my conclusion. I'm going to make 4 points, and that'll be the end of the video. Point 1. Everyone's morals are different. That is expected in a subjectivist worldview. I'm going to make a claim, and I'm going to say that there are no two people who exist in the world who share the exact same morality. That's fair to say. Imagine the complex web of all the moral truths that there are, like abortion, self-defense, death penalty, animal rights, global warming, gay marriage, immigration, all these things. Very complex. There's no two people who agree entirely on all of those things alone. I'll even take it a step further and claim that there are no two people in the world who agree on not just every moral truth, but there are no two people in the world who agree on a single moral truth. What do I mean by that? Of course, there's people who agree that, like, abortion, for example, is okay. And so, Bubba, you're stupid. What are you talking about? What I mean by that is if you were to take two people who were to examine a moral truth, such as the death penalty, is it okay? Yes or no? If both people say, yes, it is okay, the next question should be, okay, how good or bad is it? How strongly do you agree with the death penalty? Those two people will come to some sort of disagreement. Person 1 might say that the death penalty is justified for serial killers and serial killers alone, while person 2 might say serial killers, rapists, and pedophiles should all get the death penalty. That's a disagreement. That's a subjective impulse to the same moral truth claim. I bring this up because even though these people agree, yes or no, on a moral truth, they actually, turns out they disagree on the severity of the moral truth, which comes down again to a person's intuitions. It is 100% expected in a subjectivist moral framework for two people to not only agree on moral truths, but to not be able to fully agree on the severity of a single moral truth. Which leads me to point 2. Everyone's morals are similar. What the fuck are you saying, Bubba? You just said that everyone's morals are different. Now you're saying they're similar. Different, similar. What the fuck gives? You're contradicting yourself. And I'm saying no. Firstly, different and similar. Things can be different but similar. Things can't be different but the same, but they can be different but similar. So, and also contextually, what I mean by this is when I'm making this statement, first let's look back at this source chart, like where morality comes from. I used this earlier, and let's see what I'm talking about here. When I'm saying that our morals are similar, what I'm referring to is the people that have been raised in a similar society, the moral intuitions which you have received from a society, the third biggest circle. Society, remember, means the immediate environment in which a person is exposed to. So it is very likely for people living in the American South in the year 1950 to still hold a lot of racism towards African Americans. This is expected by people who grew up in a similar environment, in a similar society, if you will. However, under an objectivist worldview, all these people should have a moral law which points them towards what is ultimately good. So why are people in the American South in the 1950s so racist? This explanation isn't as clean as it is under a subjectivist worldview. You can fit it in, but I'm saying it is not as clean. You can try to you have to twist your arm more to kind of explain this from a more objectivist instead of a subjectivist. Which leads me to my third point, by the way. The third point is that society's morals change over time. Society's morals change over time. Again, this is perfectly explainable under a subjectivist moral worldview. In the 1940s and 50s, America had very different views on how women ought to behave than we do in the 2020s America. Why is that? A subjectivist would simply say that the reason is because the environment of America has changed since the 50s, as it has to the 20s. History is the main determiner. Let me go back. History is the main determiner, the biggest circle for which determines a person's morality. So it makes perfect sense as to why women ought to behave differently in the 1950s versus the 2020s. But from an objectivist worldview, what is the explanation for this? Saying that, what is the explanation from an objectivist worldview that in the 1950s, women preferred to not have a job, stay at home, homeschool the kids, cook breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and clean the house? And now the women are more tuned to having jobs, making money, providing a lot of roles which men would have had in the 1950s. The explanation for this is either did the ultimate moral lawgiver, did God's change his mind and decide that women should now attempt to work and have more jobs, and that's why the women's intuitive system is pointing towards this idea? Or is it that the objective moral lawgiver just doesn't exist, and that it's simply because women are now required to as a result of the history of America, and that they need to get jobs for themselves? In this case, that women need to get jobs in order to provide for themselves and for their homes because of the wage gap under a capitalistic society. Which leads to my fourth and final point. Psychopaths. Psychopaths, I find to be the most intriguing proof for subjectivist worldview. Most intriguing, by far. Now, under a subjectivist worldview, psychopaths are explained very straightforward. Psychopaths are people with no moral compass. That means the intuitive moral system which determines good, bad, right, and wrong just doesn't exist. So they don't care about any of these things on your screen. None of these things. They don't care. Shit. Move myself up here. It's not controversial to say that when an individual doesn't have a moral system, that's perfectly explainable. It's rational to say under a subjectivist worldview. But what does the objectivist have to say about this person? Your instinct might to say that, yeah, this person wasn't given God's moral law either. So that just means that the moral intuitions which God gave to 99.9% of the world just wasn't given to a psychopath. That isn't a problem, and it makes sense. Unless you believe that God is all loving, all good, and all just, which is the problem of evil, which I'm going to do in a different script, probably very soon. But ultimately, for now, the explanation for psychopaths is that an objectivist worldview is nowhere near as clean. It doesn't fit nearly as clean as in a subjectivist worldview. It just means that God, basically, or the objective moral lawgiver, gave an objective law to 99.9% of people, but just forgot about the 0.1% of psychopaths. And that's the end of my script. Oh, I'll make myself big for a goodbye. Yeah, that's the end of my script, so bye.